Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Bill Botel. I'm from Pacific Friends of the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB and malaria, and the former Executive Director of the Global Fund, Mark Dybel, and the current External Relations Director of the Fund, Christoph Ben, both wanted to pass on to Dori, Beck, Alana and the Kirby community, UNSW, their condolences and great sympathies on the death of David. When I first met David in 1982-3, when the AIDS problem became big in this country and was becoming out of control, under the leadership of Neil Blewett, it became very apparent that very radical responses were needed. And the one quality I remember of all of David's great positive qualities at that time was his impatient indignation expressed to Dr. Blewett and to me and to others about how unsuited and unsatisfactory were the responses that were coming out of the orthodox establishment in 82, 83 and 84. And he very quickly, and it wouldn't have come from his training, he understood the great public health requirement was that you could not do the same old thing in the same old way in traditional establishment way of thinking and get on top of this problem. You had to bring in the communities that were most affected and give them an equal preponderance, say, in fact, at the policy-making table, and that the thing could be prevented. This was a very great insight. It sounds so obvious to all of us in this room, but it was not obvious then, and I sometimes think it's not obvious now. So David was a pioneer of prevention, and that made him have to rethink a lot of his training and approaches and then to persuade others of the merits of that. And of course, building trust with the communities most affected was imperative in Australia and in Sydney. And David led the way in that. And so we come to Joe Watson, who has for 30 years exemplified that community-based response, the imperative need to have the people who are most affected have the greatest say in how the money's going to be spent to the greatest effect. And David facilitated and understood that all of his career, and we thank him for that. Joe has had a tremendous career in HIV and AIDS for 30 years. She was a long-time Executive Director of the National Association of People with HIV Australia and worked with Positive Life and has contributed immensely to that policy discussion and to the development of that community-based response, and now is very eminently the Deputy Chair of the Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Council and would have played a very big part in the recent decision about PrEP and going on the PBS. It's my very great privilege and honour to welcome Joe.
Thanks for those kind words, Bill, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm honoured to have the opportunity to share some impressions from over the years. The HIV response in this country has been marked by several fundamental characteristics which are well known here and abroad: a bipartisan political cohesion across governments, an embrace of research at local levels to inform policy, and a formal positioning of the place and value of community as partners and indeed drivers of that response. This photo is one of the rare shots we've had of a bunch of treatment activists out of PLWHA New South Wales, as it was then known, now Positive Life, and it was taken sometime in the mid-90s. There were other treatment advocates who came before this photo, and there were others who were taken after it. There are others who worked in other places. We've also had a number of clinical colleagues and had identified those we could work with, and indeed those who would work with us. They were silent partners, some of them, who wanted to remain discreet. There were those that loved the spotlight and the arguments, and there were those that were methodically getting on with their labour, their quests and their vocations, and we needed them all. That community presence from the beginning was also marked by a pursuit of collaborations across the domains of research, and policy implementation. David Cooper was a leader defined not just by his clinical and scientific accomplishments, but also, as Bill says, by his belief in the pursuit of such collaborations across his networks and within our collective communities. They were collaborations born of networks of primary health practitioners embedded in community, public clinical sites committed to serving their populations, and institutions such as the Kirby focused on providing programs and expertise to all of that. Integral to all of this was how quickly and decisively David worked to see collaborations directly partner with community efforts and their representatives. From a 1988 trial for AZT, where extra places were finally found through an ACON demonstration outside the New South Wales Parliament that year, to a focus on reforming processes for drug approvals, looking at new ways of regulating clinical trial processes, and the designing of special access schemes, for experimental agents to get to those who are most ill. The fundamental focus of all of that, the fundamental focus for community, was about getting more people expanded access to unapproved drugs, and working then with the researchers and doctors to also understand what that access meant through innovative trials that would develop the early knowledge of HIV disease and finally see the approval of those drugs. The National Centres study groups and networks, the old NCHECR framework, were part of those partnerships, and they were often bubbling cauldrons for energy and passion coming together from across the country. What was a feature of that time and work was that while it was driven by an urgency, it was also sobered by the pursuit of confirmation, evidence and descriptions. Networks of community partners and those working groups were inhabited by many of the community leaders, treatment officers, educators and advocates of those times, from all segments of the community response, representing and arguing for their respective priorities. David balanced that churn of expectations and that desire for attention in extraordinarily patient ways at times. And even while noting that some of those extreme responses were aimed at him, he was a generous and good-humoured colleague throughout the years. He would support our organisations in the face of funding questions, in talking to funders, politicians and others. He spent time in dialogue with community leaders and activists, many often his own patients, as well as those working with the more established PLWHA networks and the AIDS organisations. He debated the issues when we were pushing for things to be better, faster, or when we were demanding more attention on an emerging issue. He would listen, and he was determined to find partnership across different mediums, even when there was frustration and tension over those intersections of science, policy and activism. Those of us who worked alongside him and who were often across a table from him during some of those roller coaster times also recognised he was a true ally to be embraced. So I first acknowledge the rich tapestry of those endeavours and partnerships over 35 years, and I give nod to community engagements across all aspects of research programs. Such history, documented in a body of publications and reports, can be found in other places and are a proud reference to those efforts. Sex workers collectively organised and struck out in pursuit of changing social behaviours. Injecting drug use leaders and their supporters risked so much to distribute the clean needles and collect baseline numbers, literally at the street and lane level. Gay men rallied and talked and strategised. They would do anything, something, pretty much grabbed all of us along the way to assist. As all of this was unfolding, long-standing approaches of policy development, investigations and explorations of the Australian experience of AIDS in the domains of the clinic and the social had begun. So trailblazing new territory, growing new networks and organisations, there were heady mixtures of treatment activists, clinical advocates, partnerships across public and private, with doctors, nurses, support staff and others. Information was shared in forums, publications and newsletters were developed and became references and trusted sources of news and ideas to argue about. So recognising all that, I now want to highlight just a few examples of community engagement in HIV clinical research. They are implicitly, in my mind, demonstrations of the relationships shared across the HIV positive populations with their doctors and in pursuit of answers for questions about the impacts of HIV that mattered to those living with it. I first note a couple of local efforts. A longer-term initiative started within the concept of an AIDS brain bank to what has become the Australian National Neuro-AIDS Brain and Tissue Bank. Born out of those very early clinical observations of AIDS dementia and evolving into more nuanced work, it is a critical area still to this day, but hopefully with results understood and more to come in the future. A personal and intensely felt target for many looking for answers directly related to HIV in the brain, notably through initiatives at St Vincent's in Sydney and the Alfred Hospital in Melbourne. This is a long-standing project and it's going to continue to be supported by positive organisations, especially and through these hospitals. A second Australian collaboration for highlighting. In the early days of combining antiretroviral agents, the promise of the new and potent was quickly seized on. But while the outcome of slowing disease progression and achieving viral load reduction was the focus, that soon evolved into a more sophisticated understanding of the impacts of those agents in other forms. The manifestations of lipodystrophy and lipoatrophy were stark. Exposure to the older HIV drugs saw many experiencing a range of these manifestations, which would include this loss of fat from the arms and leg and face. The moderate to extreme impact included the confronting images that are well documented. The community was activated to find resolution to this, to understand how to prevent it in the first place, sure, but especially being able to support those who are already living with the impacts. So we wanted to see a product, a polylactic acid product, or SPAC filler as we then called it, to become publicly available. We worked with the company and the Kirby to support an application to the reimbursement agency, the PBAC. The company had attempted to list previously, unsuccessfully, and we wanted a way to better directly describe both the impacts of the facial lipoatrophy for the individual as well as the effect of this treatment. This study had 100 participants and 50 of those guys were not going to be able to get that product immediately and still signed up. The study results were used in the next PBAC application, which finally saw approval granted for funding and listing in March 2010. At the time, the Reimbursement Committee acknowledged specifically the substantial impact that lipoatrophy had had on the quality of life of those experienced, based and informed by this Australian work. Next, I want to move to that concept of immune restoration, and we've already heard from Cliff on it, and no joke, we did not share notes. So community advocates and many scientists and clinicians were keen to see and have a study that understood what increasing CD4 T cells meant, especially in patients with low counts, and then to test if that translated specifically in less AIDS-related illness and death. ESPRIT and SILCAAT studies were enrolled with efforts from across this country. Roadshows were run through positive organisations and treatment officer networks. Clinicians like Sarah Pett put in special effort to come along with us for the ride. We especially worked hard to keep SILCAAT recruiting. That was for the patients with the very low CD4 counts. When in 2003 the pharma sponsor of SILCAAT attempted to stop that study after enrolment for commercial reasons, a notion which was quickly rejected by investigators and patient groups, we rallied even more. The ongoing contribution of the study through the Insight Network endeared many of us at the time to that collaboration, and leadership of which Australia was proudly associated and was so intensely involved through the Kirby in driving. The results of these studies were obviously conclusive, and they taught us a lot. But it was actually the framework of the Insight collaborations that has also been a success as a model of partnerships and learnings. That opportunity also reached to community actions and shared projects. It was to see NAPWHA continue to work within the Insight group through the Kirby orbit, for years to come and on to further international strategic studies. In 2008, David penned an editorial in the LANCET where he talked about the sinister signals that our work is not yet done. In the presence of antiretrovirals, the average life expectancy of a person had increased dramatically, but he noted that there was still a 10 to 20 year survival gap compared to normal life expectancy. In that editorial, David stated that the most important study for that point in time was START. I kept that piece in my files and would revisit it often over the years. There were community debates here and elsewhere, at times fierce, on the merits or not of continuing with the START study as a longer-term proposition, while other evidence had already been forming of the multiple benefits of treatment. While START was ongoing, the positive organisations had worked with ASHM, AFAO, HIV prescribers and others to see the CD4 threshold removed in the PBS prescribing criteria for all of the antiretrovirals listed in Australia. We wanted to allow choice and discretion for patients and their doctors at an individual level. But to answer the question of the merits of immediate treatment for patients versus deferring treatment was urgent. And a number of us stayed supportive of START because fundamentally we wanted to have that debate once and all resolved. Over 100 Australians with HIV volunteered to participate in the START study, and community representatives worked on community initiatives to also support recruitment here as well as in other countries. The Australian community supported the ongoing work of START to the end. And that end came in 2015 when it was terminated early because of the obvious clinical benefits of not being in the deferred arm. As Sarah noted, it was a critical piece of research in the story of HIV management and has delivered a continual set of analysis since. But it was also a compelling testament to the ongoing contributions of HIV-positive research participants in this country and around the world to clinical research over years and in such profound ways. In Australia, HIV community organisations drove and supported and proclaimed the research endeavours of our clinics and institutions proudly. We assisted in funding claims and political positioning of the research community, and we immersed ourselves often in the debates of resource allocation and the setting of priorities. HIV community leaders across the country would come together regularly to reinforce the ultimate statement, and especially coming from positive organisations, that they would continue to seek, continue to ask, and will continue to allocate a significant proportion of their own resources and intellectual capital to work with these researchers and their collaborations, because there was a drive to seek answers, to pose more questions, to confirm or contest the responses across the population, and ultimately to lead and mobilise. We had our research priorities, we had our debates, and the real lives and lived experiences of people with HIV often led to the clinical stories which ended up informing many of the formal investigations and original questions. So PrEP is the latest example. PrEP and its public acceptance and public funding as an end result to such lived experiences and community leadership from the AIDS sector. And it was a breathtaking collaboration of public health and science with communities across the demonstration projects, which provided initial rapid rollout of drug across the country. These projects were also compelling information for understanding the place and uptake of PrEP in Australia today when they had to go through formal processes like a PBAC application. Finally, David took pride in putting Australia on the international stage, kangaroo and all, and our work as community advocates and communicators was the better for it. He took an interest in where people went and what we were doing. The human condition still engaged him in wonderful ways. He sent me a note last August with a line saying that he was proud that an appointment of mine had grown out of your advocacy in our sector. That's a powerful mark of the man. David embraced communities, colleagues and patients and friends and wanted us all to collectively stay in the mix and to get somewhere together. It was once asked, could there have been any effective, sustained response to the emergence of HIV without the advice, perspectives and consent of those most immediately affected by the disease? Well, absolutely not. And we would not have had the response we did without also being able to demonstrate leadership within forums like the Kirby and with clinical research leaders like David. The voices of community were included, they were heard, and from the beginning led a tremendous legacy of work within our own organisations that advanced Australia's response to HIV. And ultimately, community leadership was about the primacy of advancing the interests of people living with HIV and those communities with the greatest burden of the disease. So David too was especially and most personally engaged to care and fight for his patients. He too was so intimately affected and shaped by this disease. The Australian community response has been delivered across the years with strong features of fierce intelligence, compassion and a powerful drive to set the bar high for the populations we serve. We've also worked to recognise excellence along the way, and working with David Cooper was both humbling and inspiring. He encouraged us all to see the next quest, to focus on what was still to do, and as he brought all his fierce intelligence, compassion and drive to everything he did, we were caught up in that wake. This country's response to AIDS, but especially the outcomes for our communities and the positive population, were profoundly the better for it. Thanks very much.